Yo, parish orphans and retrogrades. President Trump yesterday signed an executive order that makes IVF, in vitro fertilization, easier to do, cheaper to get. And this is a bad thing. I've brought on to the show Dr. Damon Cudihy, who is a very Catholic OBGYN, and he's been on before talking about the evils of IVF. A lot of Catholics don't know, a lot of conservatives don't know. This is not a pro-life measure. So we want to educate today and refresh. First off, I'm going to walk you guys through what the executive order accomplishes or sets out to accomplish. Secondly, we're going to say here's the Catholic position and why this is actually not pro-life. Thirdly, we're going to remind you guys, I think President Trump is legitimately ignorant on it. Dr. Damon, thanks for joining the show again. It's good to see you, my friend.
You too, Tim. It's been a little bit since we've been on the show together, but it's good to have been able to visit with you and your family, since then. And it's really an honor, and I feel a certain duty, that we talk about this again, especially in light of it being brought to the national stage as recently as yesterday.
I don't think there's anybody better in the entire country to do this with than you. So that's why we keep having you on anytime.
Well, that's kind of you can say. I don't know if I agree, but maybe I'm the most available or willing to. But I appreciate that very much, Tim.
Availability is half the battle, as Machiavelli. Yes. So what responding to from yesterday is that Trump signed an executive order on in vitro fertilization. The EP reports, here's what you should know about the procedure. On Tuesday, signed an executive order aiming to reduce the costs of in vitro fertilization, medical procedure that, thank you, helps people facing infertility build their families. And all this sounds ostensibly pro-life. Americans need reliable access to IVF and the more affordable treatment options, as the cost per cycle can range from $12,000 to $25,000, the order said. Providing support, awareness, and access to affordable fertility treatments can help these families navigate their path to parenthood with hope and confidence. Preliminarily, Dr. Damon, do you just want to take a crack at why, I think those are quotes from the EO itself, why this all sounds so rosy but isn't, just in a preliminary way?
Yes, and I think, as we did before we spoke about this, I think it is helpful at the very onset to acknowledge that the suffering of couples, particularly women, of infertility is a profound suffering, and I see that just about every day in my medical practice. It's something near and dear to my heart because of the work that I do. So I don't want to make light of that or to ignore that, and that and so acknowledging that the women who feel that they have no other option than this is because of that suffering. But that very suffering also makes them vulnerable to being exploited by the IVF business, the IVF industry. And so yeah, I think that we always need to start with acknowledging that. And then also in a similar vein, we need to acknowledge that the human dignity of these children conceived by IVF is equal to that of you and I. They are no less human beings. They are no less deserving of the full respect and full protection of the law as you and I are from the moment of their existence comes into being, even though it's in a petri dish and very, immoral circumstances. So that child, once conceived, again, is being just as much valued and loved by God as every one of us. And so we in no way are denigrating the individuals conceived by that. I think I've heard other commentators recently compare it to, as I have, just as someone that's conceived outside of a valid marriage, that's conceived in adultery, or, God forbid, someone that might have been even conceived by sexual assault, those individuals, are still equally valuable and deserving of love and protection as the rest of us. But again, on this, my take on this order that Trump signed yesterday is that it doesn't, at least now, have any policy changes. But it is still problematic, and it is clearly an endorsement of the concept of IVF. And it appears that it seeks to solicit his administration to make proposals for policy changes that ultimately would purportedly reduce the cost, which I think that's most likely going to mean ultimately cause the rest of us to pay for more of it, and make it more available, whether that's making us pay through insurance premiums or through other government-funded programs. That's not clear, but at least right now, it doesn't appear there are any policy changes. But the fact that it's heading in that direction and it looks to be seeking that, and it does, in that language you read, give a very wholehearted endorsement of IVF, which we need to understand that that is evil. That in no way can IVF be considered pro-life, and I think we can talk a little bit more about that.
President represents both power and influence, and the superlative instance of the influence that he exerts is what's come to be called the bully pulpit.
Right, I was going to say that.
This is what's dangerous, Dr. Damon, about him endorsing it, like tonally. He's saying it's a good thing, all the language, even if we look at what the order instructed the assistant for the president for domestic policy to do. It's to give Trump a list of policy recommendations on protecting IVF access and aggressively reducing out-of-pocket health plan care costs for IVF treatment. This just says univocally with one clear voice, it's a good thing. And that's why I wanted to just start out by saying, it's not.
And he's taken the position that the most pro-abortion doctors would, and I think it's proper to understand that all doctors that partake in IVF are pro-abortion, because IVF is inherently a pro-abortion procedure. So he's taken the position of the political left, of the same people who endorse the gender ideology and all of the other abortion legislation that, and to a large extent, he's opposed until now. So I think we need to understand this is he's actually starting to contradict the good things that he's done in trying to undo a lot of the pro-abortion agenda of his predecessor, Biden. So we've heard what you read just now, Tim, with Trump's language, or those who wrote the order for him. I think also at the top here, it might be good to read what our Mother Church has said in the Catechism. And the paragraph I found that most clearly addresses IVF specifically is under a title called "The Gift of the Child," the gift of a child, and it's specifically paragraph 2377. It's a little bit long, but I think it's important. Techniques involving only the married couple, homologous artificial insemination and fertilization, are perhaps less reprehensible, yet remain morally unacceptable. They dissociate the sexual act from the procreative act. The act which brings the child into existence is no longer an act which two persons give themselves to one another, but one that entrusts the life. I may have missed that. So he's talking about even artificial insemination, such a relationship. It's okay. I may have missed that. Maybe the paragraph prior, 2376, techniques that entail the dissociation of husband and wife. So a shorter paragraph, 2376. I apologize. Techniques that entail the dissociation of husband and wife by the intrusion of a person other than the couple, donation of sperm, ovum, cerebroids, are gravely immoral. These techniques, heterologous artificial insemination and fertilization, infringe the child's right to be born of a father and mother known to him and bound to each other by marriage. They betray the spouse's, quote, right to become a father and mother only through each other. I think that suffice it to say that the church has clearly pointed out that IVF violates the natural order, and this isn't an area that the faithful Catholics can disagree on. This is not a matter of debate or prudential judgment. This is a clearly intrinsically evil action. I think is how we need to understand this from the onset. And then I think even for someone who doesn't accept the Catholic Church or the Christian faith, there are a lot of there's a lot to unpack to help anyone of goodwill and honesty to understand why it's immoral.
Bravely evil is a key term there. Not everyone has to be a moral philosopher. It's not the most profitable path. That's the path I trod. I'm a trained moral philosopher. Gravely immoral and through one another alone, referring to the spouses. That means that nature is not violated through the one well-ordered means of fertilization. And anything that violates nature is against the natural law and therefore the eternal law.
Right.
That's the shorthand. And folks have to understand that even though it seems reality, not to get into Plato's cave here, but reality tends to appear in terms of semblances. IVF seems to be pro-life, broadly speaking. Why is it not? Well, if we look at the mathematics, the moral calculus, the fact that it's a violative of nature and it's involving any more persons than the husband and the wife who are procreating through the unitive act, that means it's procreative on the spot. We don't need to get too organically.
Right. It's dissociating that and actual, and I think that at a fundamental level, there's a certain revulsion, even by the couples that feel pressured into submitting to it. I mean, here you have the IVF clinic personnel telling the married couple that they may not have marital intercourse, that they have to abstain, precisely in preparation for this. So they're instructed to avoid, that, sacred, sacramental act of, of the marital love, for the sake of trying to maximize the sperm that the husband will then be directed to obtain by what traditional theologians described as self-abuse, masturbation. It's disgusting, but that's what the husband is instructed to do, as opposed to having intercourse with his wife, typically in a bathroom into a urine cup, often with the aid of pornography. Now, those are just some of the first level moral evils that are automatically routinely introduced in this. And so now you've taken the sperm artificially procured, and then you've the same time, sometimes a few days earlier, sometimes the same day, you're going to take the woman's eggs artificially procured. She has been given powerful drugs to hyperstimulate her ovaries, so that rather than the natural process of ovulation releasing one egg, the intent is to create her, to cause her ovaries to produce and develop up to 12 or more eggs at once. And so they call, for a good reason, they call this ovum harvesting. They're going to be harvesting these eggs like a crop from her body. This is painful. It's a horrible thing to witness, as I have, sadly. And then, so their eggs are taken and produced in a natural way, removed from her body in a natural way. And then you have the two gametes, the egg and the sperm. And then conception is brought about. The conditions for conception to occur are brought about artificially, literally in a petri dish by an embryologist. And that's at the very beginning. And before you've even begun to get into the issues of how many children will knowingly die in the process, the overwhelming majority of them, more than 90%. But before you even get to that, just the means by which you get to that first conception of the first human embryo is already, very troubling and problematic.
And that's the precise point. Even though the moral calculus seems technical and nuanced, what's downstream of almost every act of IVF is, as you pointed out last time you were on the show, porneia is involved, which is a broader genus than its cognate, but it involves usually, in almost every case, abortion, multiple abortions, masturbation, material fornication or material adultery in basically every case, the commodification of children. Am I missing anything? We call
I think a type of prostitution too. I think that pornography is a modern sort of prostitution, but IVF has taken it a step further and introduced even a new type of prostitution where women are not exploited solely for the sexual act, the unitive act of marital love, but they're also exploited, for their procreative capacity, where they don't have nude images of them posted on simulated acts of sexual intercourse, but you're using their womb to be hired, to be rented. So you're paying her for the use of her body in a different way, not merely for fornication or such, but for the purpose of gestating a child that is not her own. And so this is another exploitation of women that had never been seen in human history prior to IVF, where a woman's reproductive organs are being basically rented in a way that completely violates her right to be loved and treated as with equal dignity as the man, who should be her husband in this event.
I forgot about that. Material prostitution as well. Yeah, it's synthesis of all the reproductive.
I would say all the evils in the medical profession, as far as I can tell, seem to be synthesized and brought in one manner or another into the IVF process. It's not one event; it's a process, and yeah, it's hard to overstate how wrong this is. And I think another reason, another means to be able to discern and appreciate why it's wrong is if you look at the history. I think it's important to understand that IVF was not started by a morally upright physician merely trying to help women and couples with infertility. The co-inventor of it himself, Patrick Steptoe, was an abortionist. He was already morally compromised to the point where he was willing to take money to kill children. He was willing to basically, as Pope Francis said, be a hitman, be an assassin, for pay. And so that's the moral state. That's the moral state it required for a physician to be in order to start the whole IVF experiments that, of course, would have obviously killed hundreds, if not thousands, of human embryos before one ever survived the process. So he began his process of experimenting with trying to see if he could grow, so to speak, human embryos in the laboratory and then transfer them into a woman. And so before that first woman survived the human being survived the IVF process in 1978, many more died in the process. And unfortunately, to this day, it's not so clean of a process that most children will survive it. Most of them still do die. And so, just to kind of use sort of a statement, that I think it's important to understand that IVF was started by an abortionist for abortionists, and it sort of seduces otherwise morally upright people into being collaborators in an abortion industry. And so in no way can IVF be considered pro-life. This is in the realm of the abortion industry. And if abortion had not been legal first, if you did not have physicians willing to murder innocent children and call it abortion, then IVF never would exist.
Why would you say, okay, so it was started by an abortionist. Why is it for abortionists? Because
for abortionists, and what I mean by that is a broader understanding of abortionists. I mean physicians who have no moral integrity, who are willing to treat human life as something that is cheap, that they can be the arbiters of who lives and who dies. And so it's for abortionists in the sense that every IVF doctor is essentially an abortionist, because he, or she is making those decisions about who's going to live and who's going to die in the process of IVF. So it's for abortionists in the sense of physicians who do not follow a traditional understanding of the Hippocratic Oath of being willing to preserve life and not do harm.
What was that guy's name? I'm looking him up right now.
Patrick Steptoe. Like other abortionists, I don't think he deserves the honorific title doctor, but he would have been considered a physician in his time.
How do you spell Sorry to go through this.
Steptoe, STEPTOE, I believe.
That's him right here. Yeah, he's on the toes of all of the faithful everywhere.
Right, wow. Right. So he was the co-inventor. The other one was a zoologist. Was the other guy, and I'm blanking his name right now, but it'll be. We'll just say the other guy.
I see. So. Okay, let's make sure that people, this is not the first order. The first order is making lower information folk out there understand that IVF isn't pro-life in any conception of the word, not even equivocally. But I think if there's anything else we can do, we'll tend to that to just make it absolutely clear. It's all of these reproductive sins, and we've covered that. But if you read the text of the executive order issued by Trump yesterday, it sounds so good. And we're just disregard the powerful rhetorical flourishes that can be used, that can normalize things. I mean, in our society now, so much has been normalized just by television commercials with happy music playing,
Right.
reproductive health. And
Well,
that's what Trump's.
Yeah, absolutely. The other, I think there's an important point to be made here. The other guy is a scientist, a zoologist named Robert Edwards. So Robert Edwards and Patrick Steptoe were the co-inventors of IVF. Now, it's telling that it was a zoologist. And so because with IVF, we are treating human beings, we're degrading them like animals. And this is a point I make too when I speak to high school students about that. I've got a good friend who's a veterinary physician who does IVF for horse breeding, which is totally licit. It's totally good. There's nothing wrong with these kind of things applied to livestock and animals. Like cows are normally reproduced through artificial insemination. Nothing at all wrong with that. There can be an efficient way. Bulls are large, unwieldy animals. And so dairy farms normally rely on artificial insemination. And when you're dealing with, highly bred racehorses, IVF is a very efficient way to do it. So, as long as you're staying in the non-human animal realm, this stuff is fine. And it applies to other moral evils that become immoral only when they're applied to humans, like sterilization. It's one thing to spay and neuter your cow, but when you treat your wife that way, then you violated her human dignity, or yourself, and even whether you have to be, to directly sterilize yourself or for your wife to be sterilized. Both of those are violations of your dignity that wouldn't be a moral evil if it were applied to your pet. The fact that the co-inventor was a zoologist and the other inventor was an abortionist, right there at the birth, at the inception of IVF, it is very telling itself.
Right. Wow. Yeah. And it's funny that people have conceptual difficulties apprehending why spaying or neutering a cat or a dog or IVF for a bull is morally acceptable, but not for a human being. Well, action theory. This does not constitute a moral act. Same as hunting a deer is not the same in any even sense as hunting a human.
Correct. Oh, yes.
With the sex stuff, people get it with hunting, I guess, unless you're in some really, really wacky leftist part of the country. Most people get the difference between hunting a deer and killing a human. But they don't get when it comes to issues of the groin and the pelvis.
Right. The pelvic issue that some people, mockingly describe it. Now, you're on to something else I wanted to follow up with on, I think action theory, but it's this principle of, and it remind me who it was, which doctor of the church, but that the ends don't justify the means, that we may not do evil that good may come of it. I believe it's Aquinas, but correct me if I'm wrong on that this principle that just because something good happened at the end, we can't then justify the means by which we got there. So because a child, that is conceived in rape, to use a very volatile, provocative example, because that child is a good thing, is an incredibly, infinitely good, in a certain sense, unique eternal creation, that doesn't mean that we can therefore let the rapist off because something good came out of his evil action.
Yeah, sure. It's Aquinas, first formulated by Aristotle.
Okay.
And the doctors of the church. It's because approximate good is usually what we're talking about, like getting 100 on a quiz, even if we didn't study.
Right.
Approximate good, whereas observing the rules is in conformity to the supreme good, eudaimonia, moralness. So just in order to get approximate good, I didn't study for the quiz. We have a pop quiz this morning. I'm just going to cheat on the quiz to get a approximate good. What it is doing is putting a lower thing above a higher thing whenever we put, because consequences really matter. Outcomes, human beings are hard pressed to really get it into their gray matter. Outcomes really don't matter to God. It doesn't really matter whether you, provided that you're not violating the eternal law through contraception, it doesn't matter to God whether or not you have 2 kids or 9 kids. Oh, but I'd rather have 9 kids. Isn't that pro-life? Not inherently, not if you're using IVF. You can't.
Good point.
You can't pull rank on the supreme good, which is observing the procedure for
the means by which you obtain that end.
Yeah, yeah.
And it reminds me of a very kind of distilled version of that. And Mother Teresa was remarkable in her way to do this. And I think it probably comes from her deep prayer life. But she was famous for saying, "We are called not to be successful, but to be faithful." I think that's another way of stating the same thing. But maybe our hope is that we hope God blesses us with 9 children. And if I'm faithful to my wife and we're only blessed with 2, then I might see that as being that I wasn't successful in what I had hoped for and having a big family. But if I then, so if I resorted to adultery or, divorce and then a fake remarriage, then to achieve that, then again, maybe I'm successful, but I haven't been faithful. So I've really done, I've not I have not been pleasing to God. I've definitely, done my soul, a deep disservice for my eternal salvation.
People that aren't thinking about it deeply, kind of like the IVF issue is a species of this genus. If they're not thinking about it deeply, they'll look at the proximate good that's earned by cheating on a test or cheating at procreation, which is all IVF is.
Yes.
But I mean, don't you want 100? Well, yeah, of course. But what's more important than the outcome is the process. And that's for really shallow-minded people, that's always going to be difficult. Outcomes really aren't moral. Outcomes are brute facts.
Accidental, would you say? Yeah.
Yeah, they're always accidental. I mean, they're teleologically wired, so they're not strictly accidental, but they're like, for our purposes, we could almost say they're incidental. Yeah.
Okay, incidental. Yeah. I was thinking accident in the sense of like the Eucharist having the taste and, texture of bread when we know it's, metaphysically something different.
Right. Exactly.
So, and another thing too, Tim, I think it's good to point out is that, again, this doesn't take a deep dive into Aquinas and the Summa and these kind of things to appreciate. It really just takes a radical honesty intellectually. The understanding of human conception, what that is, fertilization, the union of the egg and the sperm, that has been, part of the deposit of scientific knowledge since 1876. I just looked at that data. That's pretty 100 years after the founding of our or the Declaration of Independence. Our nation. 100 years after that, 1876 is when this scientist Hertwig, using microscope technology at the time, and I believe it was rabbit embryos actually, but then again, also mammalian is a good model, was able to first see and understand and discover what conception was. Prior to that, we really didn't know at what point after the woman's menstrual period she was pregnant. And that's where these, ideas of quickening and stuff, when the woman feels the baby, but our understanding of the precise moment of conception is over 100 years old now. And it was nearly 100 years old at the time. Roe v. Wade in 1973, when the Supreme Court based their entire decision on a lie, claiming they didn't know when life began, when 97 years earlier it had been clearly established in the scientific world. So again, this is where it all starts. When does human life begin? We don't even have to acknowledge the soul for that matter. Again, talk to an atheist. This is a human being, biologically, genetically. We're talking about a unique new member of the human species. Life has begun at conception. That there's no rational, scientific, secular, atheistic argument against that principle, and everything else flows from there when we're talking about IVF, and then other things too. Now, so that's, to get to that, you've got to get a little bit deeper than the glossy cover on the magazine, which is the picture of the baby that's born, as a process. And you look just a little bit under the surface, and then we see, well, how did that baby get there, and what kind of evils were committed to where this one child that survived, that you can take a picture of in good health, how many other children were killed in the process. And so that's something I think that needs to be really emphasized. We're not trying to convince someone of the truths of the Catholic faith and or even the Christian faith to arrive at this understanding.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, folks get it intuitively that a rape might produce a child that a mother will love as much as anyone's mother has ever loved him. But that's really wrong. That's a wrong process. They just get it with IVF, and that's why it's really effective to keep having you on the show. Now, I want to if I'm cutting you off, something else you wanted to say?
I'm just on the response to that. I think that people I can anticipate are going to be really offended by that comparison, and the reason why they'll be offended by comparing rape to IVF is because rape is so obviously evil, but IVF, it's not as obvious because it happens in the back room. People aren't watching. Most people don't see that. It's not as clearly evident to us the grotesqueness of IVF, but from a moral standpoint, it is still a grave violation of bodily integrity of the children and even the mother in a way. But it's just not as obvious, but it is still there.
I'll speak on my own behalf, but I'm confident rendering this determination. IVF is vastly more evil than rape because it involves murders. Murder is worse than rape, and it's much more widely accepted. It's much more pervasive, and it's tolerated. And you have their chief executive now trying to endorse it. So yeah, in that way as well, I would agree 100%. So before people black pill too hard on Trump, who's always sort of like bowling with the bumpers, he's going from one end to the other. Now he's trying to get his wife saying abortion's good, basically. Disgusted by that. Now he's trying to do some pro-life stuff, and I guess this blunder, IVF, is his honest attempt to do something pro-life. We'll call them back to a site that you brought to my attention, on Life site, from shortly after he took office, less than a month ago, January the 27th. There's a Life site article called Trump's Top 10 Pro-Life Actions, according to the president himself. And I just thought maybe it's worth machine gun cataloging this. He enforced the overwhelmingly popular demand to stop taxpayer funding of abortion. I mean, thank God for that. Enforcing the Hyde Amendment. On the Friday before this article was written, President Trump signed an executive order to end the use of the federal taxpayer dollars to fund or promote elective abortion. He ended federal funding of abortion overseas. That's important. It's a reinstatement from a 2017 policy that he'd done in his first term. Protecting taxpayers from funding abortion. First and foremost, Dobbs versus Jackson, women's health was he can, that's a feather in his cap that he ought to be proud of its bright colors. And I'm proud of that came out of Mississippi. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So he promised and delivered to protect and defend a vote of the people from within the states on the issue of life. And he's reinstated, expanded the Mexico City policy, ensuring the taxpayer money is not used to fund abortion globally. I feel like this article could have been better organized.
Me too. It would have been good to have a list, but yeah.
I'm repeating myself. Issued a rule preventing Title X taxpayer funding from subsidizing the abortion industry. Cut off all funding to UN Population Fund, which is bad. Coercive abortion and forced sterilization. Signed legislation overturning the previous admin's regulation that prohibited states from defunding abortion facilities as part of their family planning programs. I'd love to, in a minute, get your, or even right now. Abortion is family planning. It's
unbelievable. Yeah, it's such a euphemism that it's really disturbing that's still, that still sticks. And it's also, the family planning is a euphemism for both abortion and contraception. The irony is it has nothing to do with a family and nothing to do with planning a family. It has everything to do with preventing a child from either being conceived or from being born once conceived. That's what the whole family planning thing has become. And yeah, I think it's important to, again, I think we need to call out Trump where he's wrong, where he's blundered, where he's erred in this spot, but to point out that he has done good. And I would say even taken it a further step, much further than his other predecessors that we got rallied behind. The Bushes, for example, the Bushes, also reinstated the Mexico City policy, which prevents a lot of direct, explicit funding of abortion. But Trump's taken that a step further and gutted these sort of secretive funding of abortion through like the USAID program that we didn't even know until the Doge stuff started digging into this, that they were promoting a lot of this ideology, including the so-called reproductive health care or of family planning. So I think he's taken the Mexico City policy and defunding it, and he's taken these things and a step further than even he did, it seems, in his first term. So in many regards, it seems like he's taken it up a notch in pro-life actions already, and yet this one he's kind of taken a step backwards, and so that's the way I think we need to make this case, that he's actually undermining the good that he's started to do, that he's done by this IVF endorsement. He's been doing some very good pro-life things that we need to, thank him and be grateful that God has, been able to convince him and, work through him to do this. But we do need to also point out that he's undermining and contradicting himself when he endorses IVF. And I think that's a point that a lot of people still miss, because you have to get beneath the surface to understand that about IVF.
The way that anybody will, unless they're a knowledgeable Roman Catholic. I mean, these things are downstream of the natural law: contraception, abortion, IVF, reproductive health, broadly.
Right.
But and if you're really, really smart, then you can be not a Catholic. I'm not talking soteriology here. We just mean in terms of epistemology, understanding, and you can understand how they're wrong and they violate nature. But most people aren't smart. And so you just have to rely on the culture and the teaching voice of the church. And they're the only ones that do all the math correct. And you can check the top lines match up with the bottom lines. Oh, well, IVF really is abortion and prostitution and all these other heinous things, but I didn't see it before. Why did I miss it? Because you're not trained to do the moral math. But the church will always, even its not so bright practitioners and fellow sons, that here's the quick guide to doing the math. That's why people really need to be Catholic.
Yeah, and I think too, we're culturally at a moment where, as a society, we don't think much anymore. We are so accustomed to instant gratification with media, looking at little shorts. I mean, an hour-long interview, it's too much. Sometimes people just they only have that attention span for a 15-second soundbite, and or a one-page summary of an article, or just the title of the article. I mean, how many times are people going to repost something on social media where they haven't even read beyond the headline? So I think that, again, we need to get back to thinking more deeply, giving more serious, consideration of what we are endorsing and getting behind. There's another reason why I think that it's easy to want to look the other way and not acknowledge the problems with IVF. And it might probably help to summarize again, because there's some of your listeners might still be a little bit hung up on why IVF is so wrong on more downstream. But when we get back to that issue of when a human being's life comes into existence at conception, at fertilization. I mean, there's been some social engineering to try to redefine conception to be implantation, but again, that's more of a social construct for a political agenda. The reality we're talking about is that conception defined as the union of the sperm and the egg. Physically, this naturally takes place in the woman's fallopian tube, and the implantation of the embryo doesn't occur until about a week later, 7, maybe even 9 days later, when that human being that was conceived in the fallopian tube moves down and implants into the uterus. Well, there are other things that are mainstream in the medical society that interrupt that process, that destroy that human being's life after conception and before implantation, or maybe soon after implantation. And what I'm speaking of are things that are marketed and promoted as contraceptives that actually act as abortifacients much of the time. And that applies to pretty much all so-called hormonal contraceptives, and very much in the situation of IUD, intrauterine devices. And so when you start looking at the IVF, then you're forced to confront these other things. These things that we thought were merely contraceptive turn out many times to be abortifacient, not just contraceptive. So that's where we're at this as well. And that's what a lot of the pro-abortion advocates of IVF, after that Alabama Supreme Court decision that brought IVF onto the national stage last year, that's where the Pelosi's and the other pro-abortion radicals started trying to attack the Alabama Supreme Court and pro-lifers, and Trump indirectly and indirectly saying that Trump wants to take away your contraception now. and so, and Trump, I think his initial IVF endorsement was kind of reactionary to that. And there's certainly a political motive to want to win the swing states and not want people to vote against him because they thought he was going to take away their contraception or their IVF.
That is the way Trump operates. He's a gamesman in, I think, a positive way. He's a gamesman in the sense of what conservatives needed, even though he's not the perfect conservative. He likes to strike back. And so many times in my younger life, I looked at the person we're putting forward as our, I can't even say it, political conservative best representative, like a Romney or a McCain or anyone with the last name Bush, the many of them.
Right.
And I'm just like, don't you want to get back at the guys that are naysaying you all the time? Don't you not try to join their ranks? And don't you want to really frontally assault them, facially contradict them? And they just never did. Trump is in office because we learned in 2015, 2016 how effective he was at saying, no, I'm not going to apologize. I'm saying the dead opposite of you, and I owe you no apologies. And that's what we love about him. But I think you're right, Dr. Damon, to connect the dots, that I think he thinks IVF is extra pro-life or something, and it's just not. We're trying to be charitable in our interpretation of his interpretation.
Yeah. And this is where in the kind of the Catholic world, Catholic X or former Catholic Twitter, you've seen, by and large, a very productive and good response among the Catholic intellectuals and influencers, I should say, people that, have a lot of respect as being prominent and articulate pro-life advocates. People like Lila Rose, people like the Ward and Fire Institution with Bishop Barrett, and those that are very mainstream Catholic are now, very, to much their credit, are talking about IVF, and they're pointing out and posting about the problems with IVF, and so that's good. There's this other Catholic website, Alatia, I think you pronounce it. You can put that in the show notes. There are a couple of articles I wrote last year that they asked me to about IVF. They put that back to their homepage. But at the same time, there was one prominent Catholic priest that we both know that I think kind of missed the mark a little bit. He was giving Trump too much credit and kind of minimizing this IVF thing and saying that, well, Trump just sees IVF as pro-life. That's all it is. And yes, that's true. But we do need to move the culture on this. We do need to at least start among Catholics and the pro-life community and educate one another about why IVF can never be pro-life. Why, again, it was
Frank Pavone.
Right. Yeah. And he's been, I've, really looked up to him. I think he's been an incredible pro-life leader for so many years. So it was a little bit disappointing to see him kind of let Trump off the hook on this matter. And just because, again, it's a lot of the types of abortion that Father Pavone had been, fighting against were the more obvious versions of it. And so I think that just because this is hidden and this happens at even the earlier stages of life doesn't mean we should take it any less seriously. And in fact, because it is so widespread and increasingly accepted and endorsed by otherwise good people, I think we need to address that. We can't let this go on anymore where IVF is allowed to be taken lightly as something that's just a minor, technical problem.
That's where you've been so instrumental bringing you on the show. I mean, people watch this show because they know that we can do, I think, what Frank Pavone was trying. I can do what Frank Pavone was trying to do. Look, give Trump a little bit of credit while acknowledging the grave swing and a miss.
Yes.
That's why I read, he has been pro-life, broadly speaking, but he gets stuff wrong. And this is a major, and that's why you're the best person I can talk to, because you convince more people than anyone I think has ever been convinced in any one cut or swath. That first show you came on, that this is not a technical evil when you look at its details. It's actually really, really evil. It's abortion plus. It's not abortion
Right.
minus.
And I think too, and thanks for those compliments, Tim. And I feel like in my role, I can relate to your friend Matt Frad. I don't think Matt ever aspired to be the porn guy to go around the world of the country talking about how evil pornography was, but it fell into him, and I think he sort of responded, I think, to something that God brought into his life, and that's how it is with me with IVF. I was initially early in my career much more passionate about addressing the abortion issue, but it really came through
Right.
working with patients and just personally, suffering with them, kind of sharing the suffering as much as I can as a physician. And for a brief time in my own marriage, the pain of being infertile or fearing that you might be infertile and doing everything I can, to try to restore that. And that's become one of the really the most rewarding part of my professional work is trying to help in a restorative manner, what is best described as restorative reproductive medicine, actually trying to help restore women to a state of health and to some degree their husbands so that they can conceive, which is what they really want. They want to be made whole. They don't want to bypass the whole process of procreation as God has ordered it to be. So yeah, that's something that some of us, our experiences in our life help us to see more clearly, and that's kind of where I'm at. So it's really, I feel both, really a certain duty. I don't necessarily like putting myself out there in the public forum on this, but I feel like
Yeah.
I can't be quiet about it because I have had unique lived experiences, to use one of those popular terms, that give me an insight into this that a few people have, I believe.
And that's I'll just jump on the bandwagon here and say that's how I feel about the broadly conceived patriarchy issue.
Yeah.
Feminism is really, 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 really wrong. I see it as the number one evil. But it wasn't that I was as a trained moral philosopher, a trained constitutional scholar of the U.S. Constitution. It's not a thing I really wanted to be doing, but you see a need, you fill it, and then people are like, more, give me more. And then bigger names start coming to you and write a book on this. And then you see the need. And then even my wife, Steph, Steph, got roped in and we're given coaching. And it's kind of the main thing we're spending our time on at this point.
Yeah.
It's a life we never conceived of. It's a great life because it's work and all hands in the vineyard, man.
Right.
It's made me, I'd say maybe the third most censored Catholic in the land behind NJF and EMJ only. I probably, the third most controversial Catholic if I had to rank it because of our work on the falsity of things like mutual submission. But God kind of picks you, that the task selects you.
Right. And then we feel a certain,
well,
thank you. If your listeners need a reminder, just with IVF, and why, another great mentor as a Catholic physician for me, Dr. Thomas Hilgers, who started the whole NAPRO technology enterprise of, really showing that there is a way to deal with infertility without resorting to these, artificial, so-called reproductive technologies that are degrading human life. And his aim was what I try to do in my practice, and I was trained by him and to a large degree, but particularly with the philosophical approach of trying to restore normal functioning, which is what basic medicine is. But what I really want to say about him again is that when he first told me that IVF is killing babies to make babies, that really was kind of jarring, and I thought that had to be hyperbole. Wow. There's no way. And so I think anyone who's aware of like Catholic, OBGYN medicine, he's probably the most prominent figure, at least in the United States. And he's still alive, as far as I know. And he has quite a following in that world. But yeah, IVF is killing babies to make babies. And then, so you look at it, what are the stats? And it's going to vary from woman to woman, IVF center to IVF center. But on average, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of, for every one child that survives the IVF gauntlet, from start to finish, there's about 24, maybe 25 that die. It's at least 20 to 1, in terms of children that die versus, and that's where you get to where just the sheer numbers, are staggering, and with this is for one couple, one woman. And so, I mean, there aren't that many abortionists that would have committed a surgical abortion 20 times on an individual woman. And so that's kind of where we are. And not every one of these lives are intentionally directly killed, but many of them are, by neglect. And many times they are literally thrown into the trash can, their language, like the IVF doctors. And there's been studies that even that describe that, interviewing people in the IVF centers and what they do with the so-called spare embryos or excess embryos. So if they're not thrown in the trash, they are sold to drug companies for experimentation. Human bodies being sown, it's horrifying, and so those are the two, or they're put in they're put in cryopreservation in a freezer, which is really just kind of a slow death. You actually can't survive forever in liquid nitrogen, as Father Tad Paholchik and I were talking about one time. He's a great Catholic theologian and scientist. He's another very articulate speaker and influencer in this area, but that these human embryos gradually start dying even in liquid nitrogen. It's not something that can be perpetual. The longer they are in liquid nitrogen, the less likely they will ever survive thawing attempts, and many of them don't. And again, it's going to vary which ones will even survive the attempt to be thawed, and then the attempt to transfer into a woman's uterus to survive.
Wow. Well, that's horrific. It's really, really bad. And all we can do is get the word out. So thanks so much.
Yes.
I mean, did you have anything you wanted to say as a parting shot here?
I think that the more we can talk about this, when I've spoken to seminarians in the past, I think it's important to realize that even though a minority of us are personally going to be tempted to this, that maybe 15% of couples experience infertility personally, but all of us are going to know people that are going to have friends or family members. So to be willing to, speak the truth with love. I mean, there's an art to that, being able to gently, lovingly to help people out. We're not trying to condemn. We're actually trying to save people from condemnation. We love, out of love, we need to be willing to, again, using another popular term, have these hard, difficult conversations, something that actually is difficult, but necessary. If we truly love those in our sphere of influence, our friends and family, then we need to be willing to have these conversations honestly, with a spirit of love, ultimately.
Yeah. You got to tell people that are considering IVF, are you willing to kill to make a baby? Are you willing to kill 20? I mean, I wouldn't be willing to kill one to make one.
Right. Exactly.
It's not a game. You got to adopt if you want a kid, and you can't do it any other way, or go see some good doctor like Dr. Damon that might recover the natural way. It's all providence, man. The older I get, we're about the same age. By 40, I just started learning how little control we really have. And one, exercise control is the font of so many evils. We just, it's all providence. And
it's that pride, that first sin of non serviam, right? That's kind of the ultimate existential temptation, is to want to be our own God, and to think that we make ourselves and can, have, that we're the arbitrators of, of what's right and wrong.
Yeah, we're only in the driver's seat in some secondary sense.
Correct.
Well, Doctor, thank you so much. As always, sir, your practice, I hope, is thriving, and I have every reason to believe it is, because
by God's grace, it is.
Yeah, you put first things first and second things second. You tend to get both. You get neither. Parish orphans and retrogrades, if you want to support this show, remember, consider to do so always on locals. Like this video, send it to your friends, particularly ones that are considering IVF. Leave a comment, and always subscribe to the channel. We're trying to reach our goal of 100,000 subscribers in the near future. God bless you all, and Deus Volt. Peace, everyone.
God bless you.